Welcome to Shuffle Source. I'm your host Brandon, and today we are back with another exciting Precon upgrade video. This time we will be upgrading the Prismari Artistry Precon from Secrets of Strixhaven. Let's get into it. Really fast before discussing the commander we will be using, let's quickly go over the Precon upgrade format that we use here at Shuffle Source. The first item to note is that we will either use the primary or the backup commander from the Precon. We will also be adding 10 cards and removing 10 cards. Additionally, we add a few more upgrades that we call no budget options near the end of the video, and that's for people who maybe either already have these cards or maybe have a little bit extra in their budget for an upgrade. And lastly, we do use market value pricing provided by TCG Player at the time of recording, which is displayed at the bottom of the screen as we discuss the cards. So the commander we will be discussing today is Rootha, Mastering the Moment. For 2 colorless, a blue and red, we have a 3/4 legendary creature orc sorcerer that reads, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, create an XX blue and red elemental creature token with flying and haste, where X is the greatest mana value among instant and sorcery spells you've cast this turn. So Rootha is a spell-slinger commander that rewards us for casting instant and sorcery spells by giving us large, hasty elemental tokens. Rootha only has one ability, but it's a very strong one. At the beginning of combat on our turn, if we've cast an instant or sorcery spell that turn, Rootha will create an XX blue and red elemental with flying and haste. And its power and toughness is equal to the highest mana value of instants and sorceries we've cast that turn. That means every turn we want to be casting at least one spell before combat in order to generate that token. What's important here is that Rootha doesn't care about how many spells we cast like a lot of other spellslinger decks. She only really cares about the highest mana value of an instant or sorcery spell we've cast. That means that this deck isn't really about storming off with a bunch of smaller spells. Instead, it's more about casting more big, splashy, impactful instant and sorceries to create large, threatening tokens every turn. Because the token that's created has flying and haste, it will immediately put pressure on our opponents and start dealing damage right away. This turns our spells into both value and board presence, which gives the deck a very aggressive angle compared to some other traditional spell-slinging strategies. Additionally, Rootha's game plan works really well with a lot of the cards from the main set that have Opus, which rewards us for spending 5 or more mana to cast an instant or sorcery. So the way we're going to want to upgrade this deck is by adding ways to copy our commander, giving ourselves extra combats to get more elementals, and by accelerating our ramp package. A special thanks to all of our channel members. Your support truly means a lot and we greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to show your support and get access to some exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. You can also support the channel by liking, subscribing, and dropping a comment. Thank you, and now let's get back to the video. So let's kick off the first of our additions with Ashling Rekindled. For 1 in a red, we have a 1/3 legendary creature elemental sorcerer that says, whenever this creature enters or transforms into Ashling Rekindled, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. At the beginning of your first main phase, you may pay 1 blue. If you do, transform Ashling. And then on the backside, we have Ashling Rhymebound, a 1/3 legendary creature elemental wizard that says, whenever this creature transforms into Ashling Rhymebound, and at the beginning of your first main phase, add 2 mana of any one color. Spend this mana only to cast spells with mana value 4 or greater. At the beginning of your first main phase, you may pay 1 red. If you do, transform Ashling. So Ashling is a great utility piece in this deck because it helps us smooth out our draws while also giving us access to extra mana for bigger spells on its backside. On the front side, when it enters, we can loot, which means we can discard a card and draw a card, which helps us filter for instant and sorceries we may want to cast. Once we transform it, Ashling starts generating 2 mana at the beginning of our main phase, but that mana can only be used for spells with mana value 4 or greater. So that lines up perfectly with our deck because Rootha really wants to be casting instant and sorceries that are a higher mana value so that we get bigger elemental tokens. Here we have our next addition. We have Counterspell for 2 blue. It is an instant that says counter target spell. So any deck that has access to blue, I always check to see how many counter spells that it's running. This particular deck is not really running enough counter spells in my opinion, so just adding an additional one helps give us very efficient ways to protect our commander, protect our board, and most importantly, make sure our key spells actually resolve. In a deck like this, it's really important that our impactful spells, especially the higher mana value ones, don't get countered or disrupted. And next up we have Ember Island Production. For 3 colors and 2 blue, we have a sorcery that says choose one. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it's not legendary, and it's a 4/4 hero in addition to its other types. Or you can create a token that's a copy of target creature an opponent controls, except it's not legendary and it's a 2/2 coward in addition to its other types. So Ember Island Production's main purpose in this deck is to give us a reliable way to copy Rootha. 9 out of 10 times we're going to be using it to create a non-legendary copy of Rootha, which means we get an additional Rootha trigger at the beginning of combat and more elemental tokens each turn. It's also a 5-mana spell, so if we cast it before combat, it guarantees us at least one 5/5 elemental from Rootha if she's on the board, and with multiple Roothas on the battlefield, that will give us an additional elemental. The flexibility it has is kind of a nice bonus as well. In rare situations, we may want to copy an opponent's creature to get some extra utility or value. But again, the primary goal here is we want to get as many Roothas on the board as we can so we can get a lot of elementals from her. And here we have our next edition, Full Throttle. For 4 colors and 2 red, we have a sorcery that reads, after this main phase, there are 2 additional combat phases. At the beginning of each combat phase this turn, untap all creatures that attack this turn. So Full Throttle is a powerful spell to add to this deck. In fact, it is my favorite addition that we're adding here because it's going to give us 2 extra combat phases in the single turn. Why that's really important is because Rootha triggers at the beginning of each combat. Since Full Throttle also has a mana value of 6, we're going to create a 6/6 flying hasty elemental token at each combat step, and we are getting 3 combat phases this turn. So if this spell resolves, the way this will play out is in our first combat, we will create one 6/6 and swing in for 6 damage. Second combat, we create another 6/6, and now we swing both in for 12 damage. And then in our third combat, we will create another 6/6 and then swing in all 3 for an additional 18. That's a total of 36 damage in one turn from just your created elementals swinging. That doesn't include anything else that you may also have on the board that you're attacking with. So here's our next addition from the main set. We have Improvisation Capstone. For 5 and 2 red, we have a sorcery lesson that reads, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile cards with total mana value 4 or greater. You may cast any number of spells from among them without paying their mana costs. It also has a new mechanic called Paradigm. Then exile this spell. After you first resolve a spell with this name, you may cast a copy of it from exile without paying its mana cost at the beginning of each of your first main phases. So Improvisation Capstone is a powerful late game card in this deck because it turns one big spell into multiple free spells over time. At 7 mana, it already guarantees us a 7/7 elemental from Rootha when we cast it before combat. On top of that, it gives us a chance to hit additional impactful spells off the top of our library. And since we're running a lot of higher mana value spells in this deck, there's a good chance that we'll hit something meaningful. What really makes this card stand out is that new Paradigm mechanic. After the first cast, we're going to get to cast a copy of it for free at the beginning of each of our first main phases for the rest of the game. That means every turn we're generating even more free spells and more opportunities to create large elemental tokens. Next up, we have Molten Core Maestro. For 1 in red, we have a 2/2 creature goblin bard that has Menace, and it also has Opus. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. If 5 or more mana was spent to cast that spell, add an amount of red mana equal to this creature's power. So Molten Core Maestro is a great support piece in this deck because it's going to reward us for casting spells, which this deck always wants to be doing. Every time we cast an instant or sorcery spell, it's going to grow by putting a +1/+1 counter on it, which makes it a more relevant threat over time. The most important part of this card is that since we're running a lot of spells with mana value 5 or greater to maximize Rootha's tokens, that's going to let us generate red mana equal to its power, effectively refunding us part of the cost of our bigger spells, or in some cases, even ramping us forward. And here we have Quantum Misalignment. For 4 colorless and a blue, we have a sorcery that says, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it isn't legendary. It also has Rebound. If you cast this spell from your hand, exile it as it resolves. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast this spell from exile without paying its mana cost. So Quantum Misalignment is an excellent addition to this deck because it is another way for us to copy our commander. Creating a non-legendary copy of Rootha means we now will get multiple Rootha triggers at the beginning of each combat, which in turn means we're creating more elemental tokens. And since this is also a sorcery spell, when we move to combat, both Roothas will trigger. That means from this single spell, we're going to be getting 2 5/5 flying hasty elementals right away, and with Rebound, we get to do it again the following turn, Scaling that even further, here we have the next of our additions. We have Resonating Loot. For 2 colorless, a blue and a red, we have an artifact that says lands you control have tap, add 2 mana of any one color. Spend this mana only to cast instant and sorcery spells. You can also tap it, draw a card, activate only if you have 7 or more cards in your hand. So the reason we like Resonating Loot in this deck is because it will make it much easier for us to cast higher mana value spells every turn. It effectively doubles the mana value that our lands produce for any instant and sorcery spells that we cast. Not only is that important for casting multiple spells per turn, but it also helps us cost those very high mana value spells, which turns into larger elemental tokens. Now the card draw ability it has is quite situational, but there could be times where you do have 7 or more cards in your hand. So why not just get an additional card? And here we have Spark Double for 3 colorless and a blue. We have a 0/0 creature illusion that says, you may have Spark Double enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature or planeswalker you control, except it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it if it's a creature. It enters with an additional loyalty counter on it if it's a planeswalker, and it isn't legendary. So Spark Double is another great add here because it gives us a very mana efficient way to create another copy of Rootha. Even though this copy spell is not an instant or sorcery, it is still a very good way to create a non-legendary copy of our commander. And again, just like we mentioned with the other copy spells, more Roothas equals more elemental tokens. And while we're typically going to be just copying Rootha with many of our copy spells, this one included, there could be situations where maybe we want to copy another strong creature in the deck that provides us a lot of value or can help us close out the game. So I don't want to take away from the fact that we can also just copy other important things. So casting this spell doesn't trigger Rootha itself, but it significantly increases our payoffs of every instant and sorcery spell we cast afterwards if we can keep those Roothas on the board. And here we have the last of our additions. We have World at War. For 3 colors and 2 red, we have a sorcery that says, after the first post-combat main phase this turn, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. At the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures that attacked this turn. It also has Rebound. If you cast this spell from your hand, exile it as it resolves at the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast this card from exile without paying its mana cost. So World at War is another great extra combat spell that we want to add to this deck. Giving us additional combat steps means we're going to get more Rootha triggers for even more elemental threats. Similar to how we want to use Full Throttle, Rootha triggers at the beginning of each combat, so we're creating additional elemental tokens each time we go to combat. Since this is a 5 mana spell, we at minimum will be making a 5/5 flying hasty elemental, and those can immediately attack in each combat step. Now what really helps make this card a good contender to add is because of the fact that it has Rebound, which means we get to cast it again for free on our next turn, which means yet another extra combat and another Rootha trigger for no additional cost. Hey everyone, I wanted to take a moment to give a huge shout out to our partner, the Mighty Meeple. If you're in or visiting the Concord, North Carolina area, the Mighty Meeple is the local game store to check out. Their team is friendly, knowledgeable, and always ready to help you find exactly what you need. From magic and board games to minis and more, whatever your hobby, they've got you covered. And even if you're not local, no problem. You can shop for Magic singles and other TCGs at mightymeeple.com. Thank you. And now let's get back to the video. We've now made it to the removals portion of the video. We're going to kick things off with Abstract Performance. For 5 colors and a blue, we have a sorcery that says, exile the top 4 cards of your library in a face-down pile. Then exile the top 4 cards of your library in a face-down pile. An opponent chooses one of those piles. Put that pile into your graveyard. Look at the cards in the other pile. You may cast a spell from among them without paying its mana cost. Put the rest into your hand. So while Abstract Performance is an interesting card, it is just a bit too inconsistent to keep in this deck. It splits the cards into 2 piles, and then an opponent gets to choose which one we get to put in the graveyard. Which means almost in every case, they're going to try to deny us the better option, especially if they see a strong spell in the face-up pile. Or if in the face-up pile they don't see anything good, they're just going to choose the face-down pile. While we do get some value either way, it's just not reliable, and this deck really wants consistency when it comes to casting impactful spells each turn. On top of that, we're not really built to take advantage of cards going into our graveyard, so losing one of those piles doesn't benefit us in really any meaningful way. Next, we have Creative Technique for 4 colors and a red. We have a sorcery that has Demonstrate. When you cast this spell, you may copy it. If you do, choose an opponent to also copy it. Shuffle your library, then reveal cards from the top of it until you reveal a non-land card. Exile that card and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So Creative Technique can be a fun card, but it's not something that I want to see in this particular build. The effect is very random. We're relying on it to hit something impactful off the top of our deck, and we really don't have any control over that outcome. On top of that, Demonstrate is a real downside here in my opinion. I really don't like giving my opponent value for, again, another very random effect like this. There are often times where your opponent is going to get a better hit off this than you will. I do want to also mention that we did add Improvisation Capstone here, which fills a similar role, but it does so in a bit of a more consistent and controlled way without giving our opponents any value. Next up, we have Dance with Calamity for 7 and a red. We have a sorcery that says Shuffle your library. As many times as you choose, you may exile the top card of your library. If the total mana value of the cards exiled this way is 13 or less, you may cast any number of spells from among those cards without paying their mana costs. So, Dance with Calamity is a big flashy spell, but again, it is just a bit too inconsistent for this deck. While it does feature a high mana value and can create large elemental tokens with Rootha, the actual payoff the spell provides is unpredictable. If you get a little too ambitious, you can easily exile too much and end up casting nothing. And if you play it too safe, you might not get enough value to justify spending the 8 mana. So that makes it a very swingy and unreliable card. In this particular deck, we'd much rather spend that mana on something that will help us to be much more consistent, like copying our commander or getting additional combat steps. Effects that we know will convert directly into pressure and helping us close the game. Here we have our next removal, Harmonic Prodigy. For 1 and a red, we have a 1/3 creature human wizard that has prowess. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And it also says if an ability of a shaman or another wizard you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So Harmonic Prodigy is a very powerful card and a great reprint, but it doesn't fit well in this deck. Its ability only doubles triggered abilities from shamans and wizards, and our commander Rootha isn't either of those creature types. On top of that, the deck itself really doesn't have enough shamans or wizards to really take advantage of this effect. So even though this is a strong card in the right deck, it just does little for us here. And here we have Mirrorwing Dragon for 3 colors and 2 red. We have a 4/5 creature dragon that has flying. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell that targets only this creature, that player copies that spell for each other creature they control that the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. Mirrorwing Dragon can be a good card in the right deck, but again, this is not that deck. Its ability only works when we cast spells that target a single creature we control, and this deck doesn't run enough of those kind of spells to make it reliable. Most of our instant and sorceries are not really about buffing or targeting our own creatures, so that means most of the time you could really just treat this as a 5 mana 4/5 creature with flying. Honestly, I think you'll be much more happier adding any of the other additions over this card. And here we have Molten Tributary. It is a land that also is an island mountain that you can tap to add either a blue or a red, and this land enters tapped. So Molten Tributary always enters tapped and doesn't offer any additional upside. Since this deck is running 38 lands, we can also afford to trim one, especially with some of the ramp that we've added in the upgrades. When looking at which lands to cut, I prefer to remove the ones that slow us down without giving us anything extra. So this can just only produce any of the 2 colors and it always enters tapped. While some of the other tapped lands in our deck at least provide us some version of additional utility or flexibility. And here we have our next removal, Plarg and Nasari for 3 colors and 2 red. We have a 5/4 legendary creature, Orc Ifrit. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. An opponent chooses a non-land card exiled this way. You may cast up to 2 spells from among the other cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. So while stealing and playing your opponent's cards is fun, that's not what this deck is really trying to do. Also consider at 5 mana, it doesn't give us any immediate value the turn that it comes down. We have to wait until our next upkeep to get anything out of it. On top of that, it also relies on our opponents to choose which card we don't get, and the rest of the value depends on what's in the other players' decks. So again, with this deck, we'd rather spend the 5 mana on an instant or sorcery that will give us immediate impact and will hopefully create us a large elemental with Rootha. And this card just doesn't do that. And here we have our next removal, Rootha, Mercurial Artist. For 1 blue and a red, we have a 1/4 legendary creature Orc Shaman. For 2 colorless, return Rootha to its owner's hand, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So this version of Rootha is likely just in the deck because the deck features another version of her as the face commander. So we have to pay 3 mana to cast it, and then we have to pay another 2 mana to activate the ability, which then also returns this card to our hand. So that means in total we're investing a lot of mana just to copy a single spell, and we lose board presence in the process. So copying spells isn't bad, this is just a very expensive way to do it. Next up, we have Throes of Chaos. For 3 colors and a red, we have a sorcery that has Cascade. When you cast the spell, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. Put the exiled card on the bottom in a random order. It also has Retrace. You may cast this card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to paying its other costs. So Throes of Chaos is an okay card, but all of the upgrades that we're adding in place of it will just provide us much more value. While Cascade does have the ability to give us some additional value, it's very inconsistent, and we don't have control over what we're hitting. And even though Retrace will let us cast it again later, we have to discard lands to do it, which is not something we necessarily want to be doing. Overall, I just think there are much stronger spells that we'd rather be casting. And here we have the last of our removals. We have Volcanic Torrent. For 4 colors and a red, we have a sorcery that has Cascade. Whenever you cast a spell, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. Put the exiled cards on the bottom in a random order. Volcanic Torrent deals X damage to each creature and planeswalker your opponents control, where X is the number of spells you've cast this turn. So Volcanic Torrent can be a pretty solid card, but it doesn't really fit with the way this deck is built. The power of this card scales based on the number of spells we're casting in a turn, and we're not trying to cast a lot of small spells. This deck is really focused around casting fewer high impact, high mana value cards, so this card won't really deal as much damage as we would like it to. The Cascade is also a bit awkward here. Since this is a 5 mana spell, we're only cascading into something that costs 4 or less, and a lot of the spells that we added and the spells that we want to be hitting are 5 mana or more. On top of that, we already do have multiple board wipes in the deck, so this ends up being pretty redundant without being the most effective option. Hey everyone, Shuffle Source is heading to MagicCon Vegas. To celebrate, we're hosting a giveaway. One lucky winner will receive a Secrets of Strixhaven Play Booster Box shipped directly to them. You don't have to be attending the convention to enter, we want everyone to join in on the fun. Just follow the link in the description to find out how to enter and to see the official rules. Good luck to everyone who enters. And now let's get back to the video. And we've now made it to the no budget options portion of the video, and we're going to kick things off with Jeska's Will. For 2 colorless and a red, we have a sorcery that says choose one. If you control a commander as you cast the spell, you may choose both. Add red for each card in target opponent's hand. Exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. So Jeska's Will is an excellent setup card in this deck. While it's not a high mana value spell for Rootha, it does give us the resources we need to cast big spells that matter. If we control our commander, we get both modes, which means we can generate a large amount of red mana based on our opponent's hand size, and we can exile the top 3 cards of our library to play them that turn. So while this card is not a payoff, it is an excellent enabler for us to set up massive turns. And here we have our next no budget option. We have Rhystic Study. For 2 colorless and a blue, we have an enchantment that says whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. So Rhystic Study is one of the best card draw engines in Commander, period. It's going to give us a steady stream of cards as our opponents cast spells, which helps us keep our hand full and ensures that we always have something to cast to trigger Rootha. Since this deck relies on us casting at least one impactful spell every turn, having consistent card draw like this is extremely important. This will help us maintain our pressure and keep us generating those elemental tokens without running out of gas. Also, make sure you pick up this copy of the card so that if your opponent's groan about it, you can show them that you're actually playing the copy that has Rootha on it. So it's actually thematic to the deck if you think about it. And here we have the last of our no budget options. We have Seagate Restoration. For 4 colors and 3 blue, we have a sorcery that says draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1. you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. You can also play it on its backside for Seagate Reborn, which is a land that says as Seagate Reborn enters the battlefield, you may pay 3 life. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped, and it can tap for a blue mana. So the reason we want to consider adding this card to the deck is because it checks multiple boxes at once. On the front side, it's a high mana value spell, which means it can create a very large elemental with Rootha, which in this case would be a 7/7. It also gives us the potential for a massive burst of card draw, letting us fill our hand even further and keep us casting impactful spells in future turns. And if we are desperate for a land, we can play it as a land instead. That flexibility is huge in a deck where hitting our land drops early matters. And there you have it. After upgrading this deck, we have a final upgrade cost of $53.83. This total does not include the no budget options that we covered. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe for more videos. I think Secrets of Strixhaven is shaping up to be the best set of the year. Let me know in the comments below what you think about it and which commanders you're planning on building. Until next time, thank you for watching.